All right, listeners, buckle up. We've got a really intriguing situation brewing in Guyana. You guys sent us some material on their upcoming 2025 election, and it looks like things are getting a little heated.
Oh, fill me in. What's going on down there?
It all centers around this debate about using biometrics for voting.
Election integrity. Always a hot topic.
You said it. We're diving headfirst into a press conference from the PNCR.
The PNCR. Remind me.
The People's National Congress Reform. They're the main opposition party in Guyana, and they're not holding back when it comes to their criticism of the Guyana Elections Commission.
Uh-oh. This sounds juicy. What's got them all riled up?
Well, they were really pushing for using biometrics in the election.
Okay, makes sense. Wanting to ensure a secure and fair process.
Right. But the GECOM chair, a woman named Claudette Singh, decided against it.
What was her reasoning?
She basically said there just isn't enough time to get the whole system up and running before the election.
Interesting. That seems like a pretty practical concern.
You'd think so, right? But the PNCR is absolutely furious about this.
I can imagine. What's their take?
Their leader, Aubrey C. Norton, well, he didn't mince words, let me tell you.
What did he say?
He called her decision uninformed, irresponsible, even went so far as to use words like devious and conniving.
Wow. He's really pulling no punches. Those are some serious accusations. It sounds like they're basically suggesting that there's something fishy going on.
It definitely seems like they're trying to paint her decision as a deliberate attempt to obstruct a fair election.
It makes you wonder what's behind this strong reaction. Is it purely about election security, or could there be other motives at play?
Well, remember that word dilly-dallying you mentioned earlier?
Yes.
Yes.
That really stuck with me. Like there was some sort of intentional delay tactic happening.
Norton's claiming that the GECOM chair stalled discussions about biometrics for a whopping 4 years.
4 years? Wow. That's a long time to drag something out. Makes you wonder if it was a deliberate move.
And the PNCR is definitely suggesting that it was. They're claiming that the GECOM chair was basically siding with the ruling People's Progressive Party, the PPP, this whole time.
So by framing the delay as intentional, they're positioning themselves as the true champions of a fair and transparent election.
That's exactly it. They want to look like the good guys, the ones fighting for the people. They're making a big deal about how they've been consistently advocating for both biometrics and a clean voters list.
Okay, that makes sense. Playing the long game, building that image of themselves as the defenders of democracy.
And they say they've even been engaging the public and the international community on this issue for years. Norton flat out says he doesn't believe the GECOM chair ever had any intention of actually implementing these measures.
So if they're so convinced that biometrics are essential, what do they propose doing now that the GECOM chair has ruled against it? They can't just sit back and accept this, can they?
Well, this is where things take a really interesting turn. They're calling for the GECOM to solicit proposals from international firms that specialize in biometrics.
Trying to bring in outside expertise, I see. That could be a smart move, especially if they can find firms with a proven track record of implementing these systems effectively. But wouldn't that take a long time? To research firms, evaluate proposals, choose a vendor, that all seems like a pretty lengthy process.
Exactly. And remember, the election is coming up soon.
Right?
Well, get this. They're saying it can all be done in a mere 4 to 5 weeks.
4 to 5 weeks. That's incredibly fast. Are they suggesting these firms can set up an entire biometric voting system in that time frame? That seems wildly unrealistic.
I know, right? It does sound pretty impossible. But Norton's argument is that getting these proposals, even if they can't implement the whole thing right away, would at least give the GECOM some solid information, realistic timelines, potential challenges, that sort of thing.
Ah, I see. So it's less about actually getting the system up and running immediately and more about forcing the GECOM's hand.
Exactly. It's a power play, a way to shift the narrative. They can then say, look, we've done our due diligence, we've got concrete plans, the GECOM is just dragging their feet.
It's a clever move. It puts the GECOM in a tough spot. If they just reject this proposal outright, kind of makes them look like they're resistant to transparency, potentially even trying to hide something.
Right. And to drive their point home even further, Norton's been highlighting examples of other countries, some with even bigger populations than Guyana, that managed to implement biometric voting systems in less than 6 months.
Oh, that's smart. Using those international comparisons to suggest that what they're proposing isn't some crazy, outlandish idea. It implies that if other countries can do it, why not Guyana? It subtly casts doubt on either the competence or the willingness of the current GECOM to pull it off.
And he doesn't stop there. He goes so far as to say he doubts the ruling PPP could actually win a fair election.
Whoa, That's a bold statement. He's straight up challenging the legitimacy of the ruling party. Talk about raising the stakes.
Now, there was another issue that came up in the press conference that might seem unrelated at first, but I think it actually sheds light on the bigger picture of what the PNCR is trying to do.
Oh, do tell. I'm all ears. What is it?
Norton spent a good chunk of time talking about their support for the Guyana Teachers Union, the GTU.
The teachers union. How does that fit into all of this?
It might seem like a separate issue, but stick with me. The PNCR is criticizing the government for putting a stop to the deduction of union dues for teachers. They even brought up the fact that courts have already ruled in favor of the GTU on this, but the government's appealing to the Caribbean Court of Justice, which the PNCR is, of course, condemning.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection. By standing up for the teachers union and their rights, the PNCR is trying to position themselves as the defenders of workers, the ones who are on the side of the people against a potentially oppressive government.
Exactly. It all ties into this larger narrative they're building about the ruling party acting against the interests of the people. Whether it's through suppressing votes or denying workers their rights, it all reinforces that theme of distrust and a lack of transparency.
Clever strategy.
Yeah.
Especially in a place like Guyana, where unions have traditionally played a significant role in politics. This issue could resonate with a lot of voters.
Oh, absolutely. They're definitely playing the long game here, trying to appeal to a broad base and build momentum for change.
It'll be fascinating to see how this all plays out. It sounds like things are just heating up.
Yeah. And we're just getting started. We still need to dig into.
They're really good at connecting all these different things together, aren't they? Making it all part of this big picture. What else did you find in those documents you were looking at?
So there's one more interesting bit in here I wanted to talk about. It has to do with, who the PNCR is going to pick to run for president.
Yeah, makes sense. Picking the right person to lead the party, especially when you're the opposition, it can make or break you.
Right. Well, it turns out that during this press conference, one of the reporters brought up something pretty awkward.
Uh-oh. What happened?
Well, the Alliance for Change, the AFC, they're another party, could be a partner for the PNCR, in a coalition.
Right. Team up to take on the ruling party.
Well, the AFC, they've said they don't want Norton to be the guy.
Oh, so there's some infighting going on. That's never good.
You would think so, right? But Norton, he handled it really well.
What do you say?
He basically just brushed the whole thing aside. Said the most important thing is getting the PPP out of power, so the opposition needs to be united.
Yeah, classic political move. Downplay the drama, focus on the bigger enemy. Got to keep that image of unity for the public.
It's like he's saying, we can deal with our issues later. First, we got to get rid of these guys. I mean, what do you think? Do you buy it?
I mean, it's a smart tactic for sure. But you can bet that those tensions are going to come back as we get closer to the election.
Yeah, I think so too. It's kind of like he's trying to walk a tightrope, keep everyone happy while also trying to win. But, we've been talking a lot about all the politics surrounding this biometrics thing. I kind of want to step back for a minute and just talk about the technology itself.
Sure, makes sense. Not everyone's a tech expert.
Right. So basically, a biometric voting system, it uses your unique biological stuff, like your fingerprints or your eye scan, to make sure you're really you and prevent fraud.
Yeah, it's all about making sure every vote counts and nobody's messing with the system. Proponents say it makes elections way more secure and makes people trust the results more. Of course, there are always critics.
Oh, yeah, I bet. What do they say?
The big concerns are usually about privacy. Who has access to all that personal data? And is it really secure? And then there's the question of, what happens if the technology doesn't work perfectly? Could some people be excluded from voting if they can't get their fingerprints scanned or whatever?
Yeah, that's a good point, especially somewhere like Guyana where, they might not have the same level of technology everywhere. It could definitely create some problems.
Exactly. Plus, these systems, they can be really expensive and complicated to set up. You need to make sure you're doing it right, or it could actually make things worse.
So when you consider all that, Norton's idea about getting those proposals in 4 weeks, it just seems even more ridiculous, doesn't it?
It does seem incredibly ambitious, yes. But remember, he's playing a strategic game here. By throwing out that super tight deadline, he's basically putting all the pressure on the GECOM. They look bad if they say no. They're trying to block progress and maybe even hiding something.
So even if it's not realistic, it's still a clever way to keep the focus on the idea of making elections more transparent and accountable.
Exactly. Plus, it taps into this kind of global anxiety we're seeing, about whether elections are really fair, all that stuff about disinformation and like people trying to manipulate things online. It makes people wonder if they can trust the system anymore.
So this thing in Guyana, it's not just some little local issue. It's part of a much bigger story.
Right. It's a perfect example of what's happening all over the world. Democracies everywhere are struggling with these same questions.
You also mentioned that Guyana's oil boom kind of complicates things even further. What did you mean by that?
Oh, right. Guyana, they found all this oil recently, right? Suddenly they're in the spotlight. Everyone wants a piece of the action.
So there's like international players involved now too?
Exactly. You've got all these countries and companies competing for influence, trying to get access to that oil.
Yeah.
And that can definitely spill over into politics.
Meaning they might try to influence the election?
It happens all the time. Sometimes it's obvious, like directly supporting a certain candidate or party, but it can be more subtle too, putting pressure on the government behind the scenes.
So there's way more at stake here than just who wins the election in Guyana. It could have major consequences for like global economics and politics.
Absolutely. This election could completely change Guyana's place in the world. And that's why it's so important to understand everything that's going on, not just this biometrics debate, but the whole political landscape.
It's kind of scary to think about, how one election in one country can have such a huge impact on everyone else.
It really shows how connected we all are, right? What happens in one place can ripple out and affect the whole world.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it, but it also makes you realize how important it is to pay attention and try to understand what's really going on.
Absolutely. We can't afford to be complacent.
So we've talked about biometrics, political strategies, international intrigue, all kinds of crazy stuff. It's amazing how this one story in Guyana has opened up all these different layers.
Yeah, it's been a really fascinating deep dive.
Yeah.
And I think it highlights something really important.
What's that?
The need for critical thinking. For not just taking things at face value. Both sides in this debate are spinning their narratives, trying to get people to see things their way.
True. It can be hard to know who to believe.
Exactly. So we have to be really careful, look beyond the rhetoric, and really examine the evidence.
You're right. We got to think for ourselves, especially when it comes to something as important as elections.
And that's what we've tried to do today, right?
Sure.
Give you the tools to understand this complex issue from multiple angles. So as you continue to follow this story, what should you be looking for?
Yeah. What are the key things to watch out for?
I think the most interesting thing is going to be how both sides adapt their strategies. Will the PNCR keep pushing so hard for biometrics, or will they switch gears and focus on something else? And how will the PPP respond to all this pressure they're facing?
Yeah, it's like a chess match, isn't it? Every move has consequences.
Exactly. And don't forget about that potential coalition between the PNCR and the AFC. Will they be able to work together, or will those internal divisions blow everything up?
And then there's that wild card we talked about. Foreign powers trying to influence things because of the oil.
Right. That's the unpredictable element that could really throw everything off balance. So yeah, this election in Guyana, it's got the potential to change everything, both for the country itself and for the rest of the world.
I think this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. It's made me realize how much is at stake and how complicated all of this really is.
I agree. It's a lot to process, that's for sure.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final question to think about. What role should technology play in making sure elections are fair and democratic?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's a tough question with no easy answers, but it's a conversation we all need to be having. Because technology is only going to become more and more important in our lives, including how we vote.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating story from somewhere around the globe. Until then, keep those brains buzzing, folks. It's crazy, right? We started off talking about biometrics and ended up uncovering this whole web of political maneuvering and global power dynamics.
It really shows how interconnected everything is. You pull on one thread and suddenly you're unraveling this huge tapestry.
So much more than meets the eye, right? If our listeners had to take away one key thing from this deep dive, what would you say it is?
I think the most important thing is, don't just believe everything you hear,
Yeah.
Both sides in this whole biometrics debate are trying to spin the story to their advantage.
Yeah, it's like they're each playing their own game, trying to manipulate public opinion.
Exactly. So we got to be savvy consumers of information, Don't just accept things at face value. Dig a little deeper, look for the evidence, try to see things from different perspectives.
Think critically. We can't just sit back and let ourselves be like pawns in someone else's game.
Right. We got to be active participants in our democracies. And that starts with being informed and engaged.
All right, so we've given our listeners a lot to think about, but as this story in Guyana keeps unfolding, what should they be watching for? What are the key things to pay attention to?
Well, keep an eye on how both the PNCR and the PPP, the ruling party, adapt their strategies. Will the PNCR keep pushing so hard for biometrics, or will they try a different approach?
And how will the PPP respond to all the pressure they're getting?
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of, will the PNCR and the AFC actually be able to form a coalition? Or will all those internal tensions make it impossible for them to work together?
Don't forget about all that foreign influence we talked about, too. With the oil and everything, there are a lot of outside forces trying to shape what happens in Guyana.
Right. That's the wild card that could really throw a wrench in everything. So yeah, this election in Guyana, it's got the potential to be a real game changer.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about, honestly. All of this happening in one little country could have huge ripple effects for the rest of the world.
It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? Shows how interconnected we all are.
So before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought, a question to chew on. What role should technology play in ensuring fair and democratic elections?
That's a tough one. There are no easy answers, but it's definitely a conversation we all need to be having.
Because technology is not going away. In fact, it's probably going to play an even bigger role in our lives moving forward, including in how we vote.
Totally. It's something we're all going to have to grapple with as we move further into the 21st century.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the wild world of Guyanese politics.
It's been a pleasure. Always fascinating to explore these complex issues with you.
Until next time, folks, keep asking those tough questions and stay engaged. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a compelling story from somewhere around the globe.